Hi, everybody. Welcome to the session. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm going to try this for the first time in my life. So first time I've used Hopin, but I'm hoping this is going to work for you. I've got a couple of slides that I'm not having a lot of luck sharing with you right now, but we'll see what happens here.
Yeah, definitely let me know if you're having any trouble sharing.
Yeah, so sharing screen is where I'm starting off, and it's not letting me do anything right now.
Let's see.
Share screen. Okay, I got it.
Awesome.
Let's try that. Okay, hopefully everybody can see me looking at me, and please let me know if you can see this PowerPoint slide. Anybody?
Let's see. I don't think I see the PowerPoint slide yet. Sometimes it takes a couple minutes, but
let's try that. Okay, still no luck. Let's try again. How about now?
It's not showing up.
All right.
Let's see.
Still no luck?
Yeah, still no luck. Maybe I'm wondering if maybe you rejoining might help, rejoining the session. Let's see.
Okay, I can try. Let me try that. I'll see you guys in a second here.
Sure. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but we should be up in a minute or two.
Any luck?
Still don't see it. Let's see. Maybe. So are you sharing slides or is it sharing your screen? Do you have to interact?
I'm trying. I've tried both, and yeah, I do need to show the whole screen if I'm going to run Xcode here. So,
let's see.
For some reason, there's a strike through on the share screen, but when I click on it, it says share.
Yeah, that's strange.
All right, I'll try one more time with a slightly different approach here in a different browser. Yeah. Sorry about this.
Awesome, it worked.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, so I can hear myself. Guys, see the PowerPoint slide then? Excellent. Okay, well, I apologize for that little technical problem. So my name is Hugh Thomas. I work inside Duke's Office of Information Technology, and I lead the mobile applications group. So Duke has a small 5-person development team that we build mobile applications, specifically for campus users and occasionally research projects. So I've been with Duke about 4 years and was kind of the first person to join that group. And since then, we've grown the group and continue to grow into the future. Prior to that, I've been involved in a handful of startup companies that I've founded over the years, and got into iOS mobile development back in 2009. So I've been working professionally in this space for just over 10 years. And in fact, prior to that, was working with other software platforms for mobile devices since 2000. So been doing this game for quite a while. So today we're going to do a very brief hands-on introduction to iOS mobile application development. I'm hoping you guys can follow along. I'm going to try and keep it at a fairly comfortable pace, hopefully, to let you kind of see how the tools work, and then to create the apps on your own local machines while I'm working through the slide. Actually, not the slides, the development environment called Xcode. So I've got literally one slide to introduce the topic, and then we'll jump straight into the development tools. So hopefully this popped up. And so, as I said, this is just the one slide, just to set the scene for everybody, to make sure we're on the same page before we jump into developing our apps. So iOS, as I'm sure all of you know, is an operating system that is created by Apple. It's the layer of software that sits above the phone hardware. So inside your iPhone or iPads, this layer of software controls access to the chipsets, the cameras, the modems, the Wi-Fi network, and so forth. And so in order to access that hardware, you're basically writing calls and making requests to the operating system. And so your app basically sits on top of, from a software perspective, the operating system. Hopefully that's clear. That's sort of fundamental. If you don't quite follow this so far, the rest of the presentation is going to be a little bit difficult to keep up with. But operating system is really the layer of software that we're going to be talking to today. And so in the last 10 or so years, actually since 2007, iOS has become pretty much the dominant operating system for phones, at least in the US. I got some data from earlier in the year. So there's about 1.5 billion iOS devices that are running in the world. About 1 billion of those are iPhones. On the App Store that Apple publish people's apps, there's about 1.7 million different applications. And significantly, those apps have been downloaded collectively about 130 billion times. So this is an extremely large industry with lots of people using applications. And as of around about a year ago, Apple announced there were about 20 million developers across the world. And that includes anybody really that's downloaded the Xcode tools. So in order to create your apps, you can build an app, as you'll see this morning, in relatively short period of time. But also there are teams of literally hundreds of developers working together on specific applications. So the scale of applications varies quite a lot from one person for 1 hour all the way up to 100 plus engineer years to create a mobile app. So without further ado, I'm going to open up the platform called Xcode that is the software development environment, integrated development environment that Apple provide for free on the App Store. And this application is going to run on your Macintosh, and you'll be able to develop applications within that environment that will then be running on iPhones or iPads and so forth. So Xcode, if you haven't already downloaded this, it's quite a big file. It's about 5 or 6 gigabytes, which will take you a little while to get downloaded. But it is kind of where we start the process and really develop the whole applications. So Xcode is version 12.2 as of today, Saturday, December the 5th, 2020. And when you open it for the first time, you probably won't have any of these applications on the right-hand side. These are my most recent developed applications, but you should all have a little button here that says create new Xcode project. So I'm going to push that button and Xcode fires up. So when you first open the application and create a new application, it asks you for what type of project would you like to build. And so 9 times out of 10, you're going to create an app. And so here we go. I'm selected app and hit next. I've now got to decide what the name of this project is. And so this is the name of my application that will come up on the screen of my mobile device. And there's various other pieces here that you may or might not have in your screen. So because I've already used Xcode before, I've already logged in as a team member of the Duke University mobile app team. I've also created an organization bundle identifier, which is also part of the name of the app that will get published on the App Store. So for today, we'll just call it the HackDuke. It's not significant. It's other than the fact that once you've set it here, you can never change it again. So name that something relatively memorable. A couple of options that do need to be matched with mine here. So there's a storyboard option or a Swift UI option. Today we're going to start with a storyboard, a very simple application, and also a UI app delegate. And the language today we're going to use is Swift. Previously, Objective-C was the language to develop mobile apps for iOS, but as of 4 or 5 years ago, Swift became the new language. There's no need for core data today or including tests. So this is going to basically create a project called HackDuke 2020 inside of the development environment. I've got to decide where to put that. I usually put all of my projects in my home directory here or development directory here. So now I've created this files for this project on my local disk. Takes a moment or two to run. And hopefully this is what you'll see once you've followed through creating a new application. Okay, so most programming examples always start with a simple hello world. And if you've ever written code before, it's probably the first example you'll ever see. And usually that's just one file, typically one file in an environment, and you just do a print or whatever message it is to the screen or the console. When you're developing mobile apps, particularly within Xcode, there's a lot of other, let's call it scaffolding, that goes around the application. And that's all provided for you, at least as a template, as part of the initial project creation. I'm just going to stop here for a brief second. I've got myself logged in twice. And so if I stop this, I won't have to hit this myself. Okay, sorry about that. So the scaffolding then really consists of a bunch of files. And so before we get into the specifics of each individual file, I just want to give you some kind of introduction here to the editor and the environment that you're running right now. So this whole window here is Xcode. And what you'll see on the home page is really the project details. The integrated development environment is really just a collection of tools to make your life easier when you're developing the mobile apps. And so this whole view that you're seeing right now is really broken down into, at least initially, 3 simple windows. Okay, so I'll just walk you through the very top level of this environment. So over here on the left-hand side, we've got the essentially a file manager. And this file manager right here has got its own set of menus, which we'll get into later today. But it's basically the top level control of what you're looking at. This main window in the middle here will change depending on the type of file that you've selected, and we'll get into those details as well. But today we're talking, or just initially we're talking here about the project itself, and it talks about the various settings that you've got for the project. And on the right-hand side, we've got another window, which really is what I call the attributes window, and that can change also with different menus on the top of it. And we'll get into more of those details as well as we go into the different features of the application. So for now, we're looking at the project level at the top here, and this is then describing those details of this particular project. So we talked about the product name, HackDuke. We also gave it a bundle identifier, which was the edu.duke.hackduke, and I've given it the product name, HackDuke 2020. Right now, it's the first version with a very first build. As you continue to build or continue to compile the application, those builds will increase, and that's relevant when we come to publishing the app on the App Store. There's two pieces to the project, the main top level project and something called targets. And the targets are really specific versions of the app where you may have, for example, a version that will go to production and a version that will be in test or in development. So usually you may have multiple targets for any given project. Today, we're going to keep things simple, just one simple target and one simple project. Okay, so that's the basics of the outline of the project. In order to begin coding, or at least the simple hello world example, we're going to start in the storyboard. Now, the storyboard is kind of almost like the cartoon view of the application. And so this is more of a so-called WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get kind of interface, where you can build features into the application and really control the logic and the flow of the application. So there's a little zoom out here, and as you'll see, the whole screen is right now just one view inside of my application. There's a side view, which is kind of how it will look when it's run. But here's the basic view of my application, and this little arrow indicator here that I can select to make it blue is called the entry point to the application. So when I start creating more screens and more views for the application, you'll be able to navigate between screens. But that blue button or that blue arrow there will be the reminder of where the application will begin. And so you can move it around during your development sequence, but typically you've got one start point for an application, and that's the place that things begin. So that's the storyboard. And that's really for our first example is going to be the place that we write our hello world application. So in order to do that, we've got to add some text onto the screen. And so we do that by adding a special object called a text box. And the way to do that is we have this plus symbol here up on the right-hand side, and it basically contains the library of all the fundamental elements that you can add to your application. So much like if you're writing a PowerPoint presentation, you can pull in text boxes, or you can pull in rectangles or images and so forth. This is the same basic idea where you're basically cutting and pasting or placing objects inside of a screen. And then when you run the application, depending on which part of the application you're in, you'll see those objects on the screen. So let's start off with a very simple text view. Actually, I'll do it even simpler, a label. So a label is basically the simplest object that you can create inside of Xcode. It's just a text string that you can change here in the controller. And you saw me then, I dropped it right in the middle of the screen. And there's a reason for that, which we'll get into here in a moment. But the label itself is basically just an object now. So you see here on the left-hand edit window, there's been an object added called label, and it contains the text label. Now, I don't want to say label, I wanted to say hello world. So in order to do that, I select the object. So you've got those little squares around the object. And I'm going to change it in the attributes window. Now, if you remember on the right-hand side, we have this menu, and you should probably by default find yourself with this little kind of filtery type icon here selected in blue. You can change across, and if you find yourself looking at a different view than I'm seeing, then just navigate across through these different views. Then you finally get to this attributes or filter kind of view, and this is where we can change the label text. And so this is a plain label, and it's got the word label in it. So hello world is what we're going to do. And that changes the text inside of my label. Now you also notice that made it a little wider, and it also shifted it off to the right a little bit. So I'm going to try and make this box just a little bit bigger by simply dragging it and then placing it again. I'm dragging it now, holding my mouse cursor down and dragging it around the screen and placing it basically back in the center of the screen and a little bit larger. And so now I can change the size of hello world by changing the font size, make it a little bigger. I can also center it in that box by just using the alignment button here. So I'm going to go put that in the center. And that's it. That's the Hello World app. I don't think that counts as coding, but it's basically your first mobile app. Now, that's all well and good, but how do we actually run this thing? And so the next thing to learn a little bit about is the idea of the target. Okay, so we talked about targets in the beginning when we talked about the project. But what I mean by target in this specific case is what target device do I want to run this application on? And so you'll see here by default, Xcode has opened itself up and it says here in an view as an iPhone 11. So if I click on that, I'll be able to basically select different target devices or different devices that I'm coding in. So iPhone 11 is kind of a good default. I can get a different size screen, iPhone 11 Pro Max, or an iPhone, I think this is an 8. So not an 8, a mini, excuse me, a 12 mini. So you can go through the different products that currently are being supported by the Apple tools. Here's the 8. And so the iPhone 8 has got a slightly different layout because the hardware has got the top bar and the bottom bar. You've got a push button as a home button in the older phones, whereas the iPhone 11, it's just one big screen with a little carve out for the camera. So we'll stick with the iPhone 11 for now, and that's what we're developing in. But I want to run this on something called a simulator. So instead of targeting a real piece of hardware, a real mobile phone, when you're developing your apps, it's much quicker and easier to develop the code and debug it and so forth, just in the context of your Macintosh. And so the way we choose the type of phone we want to run it on is by running a simulator. And the simulator is another part of Xcode that runs really as a separate subprogram. And it allows you to run your applications on the various simulators that you can choose from, which pretty much line up with the platforms that you're developing in. So here in the Xcode bottom window, you're selecting what you're developing in. And here you're going to select what you're going to run this on. So because we're developing on an iPhone 11 and it looks good in the center of the screen there, I'm going to run it on an iPhone 11 as well. And so now we've got a target of the application to run on an iPhone 11. And it's really just as simple as clicking the build and then run button, or the play button, if you like, up on the top left-hand corner. This will then take the code that you've written or the storyboard that you've created, create the binary image file for that, and then run that image on a simulator. And as I said, it's a slightly different part of Xcode, even though it's built into Xcode, and it runs as a separate kind of application here on your Macintosh or your MacBook. And so there it is. It runs, finally pulls itself up into the foreground, takes a second to boot up the first time. And this piece of code is really just acting exactly like an iPhone is. So it's running through all the same OS boots and so forth that you would find on your regular phone, but obviously it's running on the Mac, not on a real iOS device. And so there it is. And so you've got now your Hello World application running on an iPhone 11 simulator, running on your MacBook. Now the simulator itself, you can do certain things with this. If you hold down the command key on your Mac and then a left or right arrow, it's the equivalent of rotating the screen. So there it is, screen rotated. Now, unfortunately, it's disappeared. The text has disappeared, but we'll get to that here in a moment. And then rotate it again, and then it went all the way back to the top of the vertical screen. Okay, so you can do things like that. You can also add other features. Because the simulator doesn't know about the real hardware, it doesn't necessarily know where it is. So you can add location information to the simulator, and you can do other types of I/O as well within the simulator environment. Anyway, that's a very simple example. I'm going to show you now a little more complicated example so we can take advantage of the rotation a little bit better. And then we'll get into a bit more detail of other things we can add to the application. Okay, so I've just pushed the stop button. That basically terminates the application. I'll pull the simulator to the foreground again so you can see it. So it's basically, it looks like an iPhone. You can run different applications that you've written on there. You can even run the applications that come with the standard operating system as well. It's not a full featured version of all the apps that come with the standard iPhone, but it's a pretty good subset of the applications. Anyway, so back to our little application. Hello World. Now, as you saw, when I rotated the screen, it disappeared, the text disappeared. And the reason for that is, although it's centered in the screen from the portrait mode, so portrait being kind of the vertical mode, when I rotate the screen in my environment here, my development environment, you can see that the text box has dropped down basically off the visible screen. So you can see the outline of it here, but you can't quite see the text in the box because it's no longer part of the development screen. So what I want to do is basically fix this text box in the center of the screen. And to do that, the storyboard has something called constraints. And what constraints do is basically pin objects according to a specific location or a reference point within the screen that you're looking at. And so I'm going to just do this very simply by basically centering it horizontally and centering it vertically. And I do that by clicking on the text box to make sure it's selected, and then holding the control key down and dragging out a blue line. So you should be able to hold the key down and then let it go anywhere on the screen. And so I'm just going to simply do center horizontally and then center vertically. Okay, and so that's now basically constrained this object into the middle of the screen. Now, the reason I've got this little yellow line instead of a blue line here is because, if you remember, I stretched the size of that label out just by myself, just dragged the size of this thing wide and long, but I didn't set a specific constraint. So what I'm going to do now is add two more constraints, which is the height and the width of that box for the text. That way the compiler or the Xcode system knows that I want this text box in the middle of the screen with these two constraints, horizontal and vertical, but I also want to make sure that box stays the same size. And I do that by adding constraints here, height and width. And so now I've added two more constraints, and you'll see that all the lines now are blue. And so you'll see here the label has got some constraints attached to it, the width and the height. And it's also got these two constraints that are basically specific to its location. So now when I rotate the screen in my development environment, the box stays in the middle. And when I run the application back on my phone again, we should see this sitting still in the middle. There's hello world. I'll do the command rotate, and there it is. Amazing. Okay, so we're making progress, albeit slow, and we've got our first application that now is behaving more or less as we wanted. Now, it's fun and it works, but it's not doing much. So let's make it a little bit more interesting, and let's add some more screens or some more views to this application so we can add more capabilities down the road. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is add another object. So we've already created an object called a text view or a label. And now I'm going to add an object called a button. And that button will allow me to do things and navigate from this screen to other screens. So again, just like I did with the text view, I'll add the plus button here, type in button, and then grab a button. And so we grab the button, drag it over to the screen, and I'm going to basically put it on the center line again. And much like the text view, we've got some attributes of the button that we can change. So I can change here, so I can do, let's call this red, and then add another button, and I'll call that one green. Okay. Okay, so red button is of a certain size. I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger, and then add those attributes to that. And then I want to keep it a distance away. Actually, I'll do the center horizontally again, so it's dead in the middle of the screen. But now, instead of making it in the center vertically, I'm going to make it a distance away from the hello world text. So I'm now going to constrain it to the hello world object by control dragging from it. And so I can call it vertical spacing. Okay, so now our red button is sitting there a distance away from hello world. And I'm going to do the same basic thing with the green button. Add a height and a width, and control drag to red, vertical spacing, and then horizontal spacing. Okay, so now I've got a fully constrained application. If I turn the screen over, I can still see all those buttons. Now, red text is kind of boring, so we're going to make that a little more colorful and meaningful. And we do that again in the attributes window. So I've selected the red button. I will slide down here and find the background, and I'm going to choose a color. And so we'll call that red. And so we've now got a red button, and do the same thing with the green. Oh, there we go. Okay, so great. So we've now got an application that's got 2 buttons attached to it, which is great, but they don't do anything right now. So in order to make them do something, I'm going to create a couple more views. So this whole thing that we've been looking at this whole time is called a view controller. And so within a view controller, you've basically got essentially an envelope for the life of your app. And so what a view controller does is basically manages all of the objects or subviews or subcomponents within the view controller. You always start a view controller at the very top level with a full screen view. And the beautiful thing is that Xcode will let you create as many view controllers and views as you like. So what I'm going to do now is deselect the initial view controller and add another view controller. So we do view controller, and that pulls up a list of things that have view C in them. And there's a view controller. So we now have a second view controller, which I'm just going to move just a little bit north here of the initial one. And then a third view controller. Okay, the second view controller, I'm going to go back and zoom in on a little bit. And just so we know what we're doing, I'm going to make that object red. Okay, so the view now, the kind of master view of that view controller, I've chosen to make red, and the next one I'm going to make green. Okay, so we've now got 3 view controllers in our application, but currently there's no way of connecting those things together. So what we need to do is tie our buttons into these view controllers so that they actually then display. So it's a very simple trick. You just basically do select the button, hit the control button, and then drag our blue line across, and it pops up something called an action segue, and we're just going to do a simple show. Okay, so what that means is when the button's pushed, this view controller will pop up, and similarly we'll do the same thing for the green button. Oops, wrong key. And then let's just Control Z that by accident. I'm sorry, Control Z does the undo. I grabbed the width there. The screen's not quite big enough. Okay, so we'll Control drag again to green and do the show button. Now we have a rigged up application. The front hello world screen's got 2 buttons that will allow you to navigate to red or green. And of course, there's a little bit of a problem is that once you run the application and you hit the red button, you go to the red screen, but then you just see a blank red screen. And there's not really a way to go back to where you want to go back to. Now, because we did a show, this segue that we created was a show, you can swipe basically the screen to make it disappear, which sends you back. And we'll do that in the simple case here, just to show you that that works correctly. Hello world, let's go red. And there you saw the red come up. Now, if I swipe down, that basically dismisses the current view. And so that's part of the operating system doing the work for you. I haven't done any coding for that. That's just basically an attribute of the show segue. But anyway, we've now got a very simple app that does allows you to navigate from one place to the next. So let me stop that. What I'm now going to do is add another button, but this time to my red view controller, that then allows me to go back through a button. So let's do that. Okay, to keep this one simple, I'll put him in the middle and call him back. And change his color to, let's make it a black button, that's easy to see. Okay, and similarly, I'll do the same here for the green view controller. Okay, so now we should be able to run this. Actually, I haven't done any wiring yet. So let me just control drag back to the main view controller, do a show again, and then he also can go back to the main view controller. Okay, you can see these segues now, or these lines we connect them view controllers, getting slightly complicated, but trust me, they're all wired up correctly, and so hopefully this will work as we anticipate. So I go to the red view controller, and then I can hit the back button, and we're back to Hello World. If I go to the green view controller, I can go back to the home screen. Now, there's one sort of bug that I've introduced in this application by accident, not by accident, on purpose. But what I'm doing, instead of actually moving to this screen and then going back to that screen, what I'm really doing is instantiating or creating a new version of that home screen. Every time I go back to it, I create the Hello World page again and again and again. So it's like you're building up like a stack of views, one on top of each other. And so eventually, if I run this app long enough and I keep pushing these buttons long enough, I'm going to fill up all the memory on my iPhone, and it's going to run out of memory and it's going to crash. So I'll demonstrate that simply. I'm hearing beeps here. Am I supposed to do something on those beeps? Okay, just checking in. All right. So the Xcode environment comes with something called a profiler, or basically an instruments panel that lets you look at what's going on in terms of the simulator and what's happening with the code. So when we run this code, let me just show you a slightly different view here. So I'll come back to the simulator. I'll just leave it down here so I can click on it. And then if I look at the threads, I'm sorry, the processes. Where's my... They keep changing the icons for me. This is a new version of Xcode that I've only used for about a week, and I forgot which buttons do it. But the spray can there is now a symbol for the Debug Navigator. So if you go to the Debug Navigator, it shows you some very simple parameters, I guess, or profiling information of the application. So it's a simple app. It's barely taken any CPU cycles at all. And you can see here, as time goes along, it remains fairly flat at a simple 9 megabytes. And so if I click on that memory, it shows you a slightly more graphical view of what's going on, and basically a gauge of what's been actually used. So 9 megabytes, relatively speaking, is a tiny amount of memory inside of the simulator. As you can see here, 9 megabytes. All other processes are running is about 11 gigabytes worth of processes running on my simulator. Now, if I go back to the simulator and click through my red thing a few times, you can see that the memory footprint here is starting to creep up a little bit. So as I said, these screens are basically creating a stack of screens higher and higher and higher. Now, of course, this is going to take quite a long time to fill up the entire memory space of an iPhone, but you get the point, is that this application's got a memory leak essentially, and we need to restructure things. So that gives you an idea of what the tools are available. The CPU cycle is really minimal on this application, so you won't really see much happening. So there's nothing much to see there. But the profiling tool is a useful tool when you're debugging code to play around with and figure out what kind of resources, system resources you're using. Anyway, enough of that. We'll go back to our storyboard. And now I want to introduce a new concept that is kind of something called a navigation controller. And so once you started creating an application that's got more than one view controller attached to it, you end up with these segues, and the lines of navigation get a little bit complicated. And so the development environment Xcode provides basically a couple of different mechanisms for navigating through screens. And anybody that's used iOS apps is going to be familiar with these very quickly. But it's important to understand what these navigation controllers do. So let me share with you how to build an app with a navigation controller. And we'll basically just simply add a navigation controller to our existing application. So as we said, our start point for this app begins with this little blue arrow. And that means that this view controller, our first Hello World view controller, is the entry point for the application. So what I want to do is basically embed that application, that page or that view, inside something called a navigation controller. And the way we do that, we'll use our editor and the embed in menu item. And so this creates now something called a navigation controller, which is just another type of controller or an object that goes into the storyboard. And I could have done that using the plus button, just looked up navigation controller, but that embed in is a little quicker because it ties up all of the various segues or the links, the connection links. Now, because a navigation controller also now creates a hierarchy, it also controls the views that are created underneath it. And so it does that by creating this thing called a nav bar or a title bar, as it's kind of shown here, and on each individual screen that's part of its kind of hierarchy. And so as you'll see, there's this back button now that's been created for us by the navigation controller. There's no back button on the first view controller because there's nowhere to go back to. You can't actually see a nav controller in your application. It just kind of is like a container, if you like, for your application. And so because we've now got these back buttons, I don't have to worry anymore about my back segues. So I can delete those two segues. And now we've got a much cleaner view of the hierarchy of the flow of the application. So we'll run this and you'll see what I mean. It's basically the same functionality from the home screen. You've got two buttons and they take you to those different pages. But I can use a back button now to get me back to the home screen. And instead of increasing the memory footprint, it should in theory stay about the same. There's a little bit initially, the very first time you run this, you saw the step up there when it created those first views. But now we've got basically a flat memory footprint, unlike before it was growing every time I added a new screen. Okay, so that back button, hopefully you're familiar with. A lot of apps use navigation controllers, and that back button essentially comes for free as part of the operating system. Okay, so now I'll stop running that, go back to our storyboard. And so we've now got basically a very simple mobile app that, it's got 3 screens and some navigation across it. There's 2 more items I'd like to introduce. I'm realizing I'm running a little bit short of time here, but let me do a couple of little other things to make this quite quick and straightforward. So this is a navigation controller mechanism, which is essentially a hierarchy. It's, you can basically have more views here attached, or view controllers from the red button to a blue or a green or something, going down a chain, and you could step back all the way back to the home screen. But if you wanted to get to the green controller from the red controller, you'd have to go back and then forward. So there's another type of navigation mechanism inside the storyboard. It's called a tab bar that provides a different mechanism for navigating around the application. So let me just try that and show you how to do that. So I've deleted the nav controller, and instead of embedding our home or hello world view controller in a nav controller, I'm going to embed it in a tab bar controller. Now the tab bar controller in this case is the parent of the home screen, but I don't have access to the other ones. The home screen still is kind of the parent, if you like, for the red and the green screen. So I'm going to remove those 2 buttons, those 2 segues, such that I can now do a control drag from the tab bar controller directly to the different screens. So now what I've got is a slightly different hierarchy, whereby the tab bar is really the thing that's controlling the navigation through my application here. So when I run that, you'll see the tab bar, instead of being at the top where the navigation bar is, the tab bar sits at the bottom of the screen. Oop, what happened there? Ooh, okay, and we forgot somehow, because I removed the navigation controller, I forgot to take care of that that little blue arrow that was missing. And so the blue arrow is the starting point for the application. And because I deleted the original navigation controller, it also deleted the start point. So Xcode didn't know where to start from. So by choosing the tab bar controller and then selecting its attributes, you can select this is initial view controller, and that puts the blue button back where it belongs. Okay, so now we have this so-called tab bar controller at the bottom of the screen. I haven't done any customization yet, so it just defaults to 3 things called items. But I remember that I did I think the green button first, yes, and then the red button last. So let me go back and rename these objects. So I'll go into the red button here. And the attribute there is, where is it? There it is, the title. I'll call that red, and the other one green. And then we'll call this hello. Okay, so we do that again, stop, and then run the application again. So we've now got the hello, green, and reds. Okay, so really just want to introduce these 2 concepts of a navigation controller and a tab bar controller, because it's sort of fundamental when you're creating apps. The creation of the hierarchy and the navigation is a really big part of what you're building here. Okay, so that's the basics of the storyboard, creating view controllers, creating navigation mechanisms between the objects, creating buttons, text views. One other quick one I want to add for your portfolio here, if you're going to write some apps this weekend, is adding images to the application. So an image is just another object, just like a button or a UI text view, and you add it in the same fashion. So if I do image, it's something called an image view, which again is kind of like a container for your images. And that image view then is basically a space that you can put images that you may be able to download from the internet or whatever. So in order to add images to your application, you need to add something called an asset to your asset catalog. So images that go into the application have to go through this asset catalog, and it's just one step. It's relatively straightforward to do, but I'll just create that for you simply here. So before I do that, I'm going to add an image to my project by adding an image set, and we're going to call it hack logo. Okay, I've now got this asset called hack logo, which I can refer to in the storyboard. Now, in order to bring that or bring an image in from the internet, you simply have to download or create images through your MacBook and then add them to the project. So in order to bring a file, so this is my file system again over here on the left-hand side of the screen, I can add a file to my project, and it goes to my just regular Finder system, file system. And I've just downloaded the HackDude logo. And so now I've got this image file that's stored on the disk that I can then add to my asset catalog. So I'm going to drag it and put it. You've got 3 different versions of an asset. And so when you're creating a full function app, you'll need 3 variations. And this is basically the pixel density of those images. So on older model phones, the 1x is sufficient. Newer phones, the iPhone 10 or above, use a so-called 2x pixel density. And then the most recent Retina displays use the 3x density. For today's example, we'll just stick with the default, which is the 2x size. And so I go back into my storyboard, and here's my image view, and I'm going to pull in the image that's associated with that is hack logo. Okay, and that hack logo then is the name of the asset in my asset catalog. And so there it is. Okay, so the logo's there. It's got a white background, so this isn't too bad, but I'll make the background so-called invisible, and so it's just the logo that you'll see in the project. So now if we run that, and I go to my red screen, there's my image. Okay, so that's adding an image view to your application, buttons, text boxes, labels, and so forth. They all follow the basic same pattern. Now I'm running very short of time, so this is going to be a very brief introduction to coding. But this is the basic premise that I've just walked you through of storyboard creation. And as you can see, you can build quite a lot of an app just through basically storyboard dragging and dropping. So if you're just going to create simple apps showing images, maybe photographs of family members or something, you can create an app relatively quickly and then run them on the simulator. If you've got a phone, a real hardware device, and you've got a cable that you can use as a charger, and you can plug that into your MacBook, then you can simply plug your phone into your MacBook, and that becomes then an object here. Oops, should be an object here. I've got to unlock the screen. And so there it is. Okay, so this is my personal iPhone. And so I can run that application just by checking the device, connecting it to the hardware, and I can run that application on my mobile phone. So you can quite easily create a mobile app, add some photographs to it, run it on your phone, and impress all your friends. Okay, so that's a start. The last little piece I want to squeeze in here in the next 5 minutes is just to touch a little bit on the Swift programming language and to show you really how to assign code to an application. So what we have then is this file system on the left-hand side. As I said, the scaffolding that comes with a mobile app, there's quite a lot of technology to understand, to get your arms around. But very simply, there's this thing called the app delegate, which is the code that Apple kind of provides as kind of the starting point for your application. And so if you want to do things before your application runs, check high scores or do that kind of thing, then the app delegate has this method inside it. And this is the Swift kind of syntax that you're looking at. This very first function here that's been declared is called function application did finish launching with options. And this is the function that runs first after the application is booted up, basically. And so in here, you can create code, and it does this first before the storyboard is even run. So this print statement will not end up on the phone screen, but what it does, it sends essentially a debug message to Xcode that will pop up in the so-called console window at the bottom of the Xcode screen. So when you're running an application, the application runs on the simulator, but in this main screen, the main view here, you've also got this thing called a console window. If you can't see it, there's a couple of Windows control buttons here that you can open and close. But basically, the console window is the thing that basically is the endpoint, the standard out, as they say, for print statements inside your code. So anyway, application did finish launching with options is the starting point, the entry point for all of the iOS apps. So that's where you can do kind of setup stuff, again, reading high score tables or whatever you want to set the user conditions up for. And then the other piece of the puzzle is, how do I assign code, real code, not just the objects, to one of my view controllers? And so I do that by basically assigning the view controller itself a specific class. And so by default, all view controllers are the same class, and that is view controller. And so Swift itself the Xcode itself provides you a default view controller piece of code, and it's the most simple basic view controller you can get. So just like the app delegate is kind of the parent, if you like, or the envelope for your entire application, the view controller has its own set of classes, functions inside itself that run every time you look at that screen. And so the view did load method is the thing that runs first when you run that particular screen. So now, in order to assign that code to this particular view controller, I'm going to change the name of that view controller. So again, we're looking at the main screen here, the Hello World screen. And if I click the top here, so this blue button is kind of highlighted, the behavior of my attributes window changes a little bit. So now I'm taking a look at the view controller, not the objects inside of it. And so one of the other windows, the class name or custom class name, is the class that we're going to change. So I'm going to call this the Hello view controller. And that means that the code that's going to run when this runs is written in the code over here where the Hello view controller is written. Now, obviously, I don't have that, so I'm going to create a new view controller. actually I want a Cocoa Touch class. That's an object, so it's the hello view controller written in Swift, and it puts it in the same directory as the rest of my project. So now I've created this whole new class called hello view controller, and that then is the code that's assigned to that home view controller. Because I've created the custom class name, that's how I've basically tied in the code for that. Okay, so I'll just do a very simple print again, just so you get the idea. Oop, world. Okay, so again, what we'll see now is the application runs, the app delegate runs first, it'll print out hello everyone, and then finally the storyboard will run. It will run its very first entry point, which is the tab bar controller. It'll pull up its default view, which is the hello world view controller, and then the hello world view controller will run the code in the Swift class hello view controller. And that's the view did load first, and hopefully we'll see the word hello, the print statement hello world pop up. Oops. Oh, it didn't find it. So let me try that one more time. I may have misspelt something here. All right, that's not a problem. Let's try that again. Okay, so there was a little error there because I'd labeled the class hello view controller before I'd created the file. Xcode had a little trouble tying those two things together. So the module is part of the application, and because it didn't exist, it just defaulted to none. So apologies for that, but now we should see that working correctly. Okay, so hello world has popped up. Did I remove the code in app delegate? I did. So I'll go back. All right, so there we go. So hello everyone comes from the app delegate, and then hello world comes from my view controller. And so from here on in, unfortunately, I'm a little bit out of time right now, but from here on in, this is where the Swift language kind of takes over. You're able to, change values on the screen. You get access to those buttons or the text in your text label, and then you can change that from the code inside of the corresponding view controller. I'm sorry this has been very rushed and a little bit quick, but I did want to cover the basics of getting the navigation system working correctly for you, understanding a bit more about the storyboard and how that works, and then tying things into code. If you've managed to follow along, and I'm sure nobody has completely followed along, at least you've got a starting point for a mobile application. Those of you that have questions, I think Caleb has offered to answer and field some of those for you this afternoon. By all means, reach out if you've got specific issues that I can help with. Good luck with everybody on the hack program. And I haven't left a lot of time here, but I'll open up the floor now for questions if anybody's got anything. Anybody with questions? Happy to chat or not. Well, getting started, I guess, is what we've just done. So how does one get started with iOS development? So, if you can take an intro class, there's quite a lot of online tutorials out there that are a great place to start. There's a lot of different websites with tutorials and kind of getting you going. Basically, download the Xcode tool, jump in if you're able to follow along with what I've explained this morning. That gets you at least to the very first app you'll ever write. From there, learning about the Swift language. Again, it's online resources, developer.apple.com is probably the foundation for everything. The documentation is very thorough. It's a little verbose, and so it's a little more difficult to follow through if you're starting from scratch. There's a lot more kind of user-friendly tutorials out there, but if you just go ahead and Google Intro to Swift tutorial, that will give you a good starting point for learning the language. Hopefully I've been able to convey a mechanism of getting the very basic apps off the ground quickly, and away you go. How does Swift differ from other languages? So it's a relatively modern language. It's a object-oriented language, and so if you're familiar with Java, it's not that difficult to pick up. Apple have spent a lot of time and money getting some very good tutorial information available. So swift.org is the starting point for the Swift language, where there's a kind of a follow-along tutorial there. Again, if you use Xcode, you can kind of plug the code directly into applications. And again, beyond the Apple platform, there's a lot of other Swift resources out there to get you going. What you'll typically find is after a few weeks of developing code, you'll get into a few sites that you'll become familiar with online. Stack Overflow is a great place to find information that people have kind of solved before. You know, any kind of question that you have is probably answered already with Stack Overflow. There's also a number of tutorial sites out there that are kind of very thorough and kind of walk you through the basic platform development. But once you've understood what Storyboard does, once you understand what the Swift language is all about, coding stuff up is, again, a lot of online resources can get you up and running. Apple create these things called frameworks, which are essentially big libraries of tools and technologies. So we touched today on very simple UI applications, but once you end up developing more complicated things that involve, for example, maps or your location or the camera, Apple create a fairly substantial amount of technology for you to kind of get you up and running with relatively few lines of code. So once you get familiar with the Swift environment and kind of how the coding and the storyboard work together, kind of do a Google search on frameworks, and then, you know, introduction to frameworks, and then Apple have got 30 or 40 different frameworks that you can dive into in much more detail. Okay, well, I think we're out of time here, folks. So I think we'll wrap stuff up. Again, if Caleb's online here, he's going to be our point contact for the questions going forward. I wish you the best for the HackDuke session for the rest of the weekend. And please feel free to get in touch if you get stuck.